What do you make of these threats by Vladimir Putin against Finland and Sweden, as both countries are weighing up whether to push for NATO membership?
This is entirely in line with the Russian and Putin's playbook. He's, as well as conducting an invasion of Ukraine, he's also engaged in an information war, trying to use bluster and threats to divide the West, to make uncomfortable his opponents, and to try and get them to back down as a consequence of these statements that he's making.
How serious do you think he is about contemplating using nuclear weapons, for example?
Well, the Russians have in their strategy the idea of escalate to de-escalate, the idea that they would use nuclear weapons first in any conflict in order to actually make their opponent take stock and to back down. And therefore, that's part of the psychological game that Russia is playing. But nuclear weapons have no military utility in this war with Ukraine. Their political consequences would outweigh any military benefit that they would have. And actually, Russia has enough long-range conventional weapons to actually have the effects that they wanted to do, unless the intent was to make a political statement or to kill large numbers of civilians, which is what they would do. So actually, the NATO countries, by and large, are not taking these things as an indication of intent, and more a question of trying to psychologically bludgeon their opponents into submission or into stopping supporting the Ukrainians. And that's not what's about to happen. And in actual fact, the West has become more assertive in its support for Ukraine. And there's three reasons for that. There's partly the outrages of what the Russians have done and killing civilians and the war crimes. And secondly, how well the Ukrainians have done themselves. And actually the fact that initially the West was prepared to support them in a guerrilla war, but actually their army has held up. And because of that, it needs different weapons than the weapons supplied to fight a guerrilla war. And thirdly, actually, the West has seen how bad the Russians have been, and therefore realized that their military is potentially defeatable. And therefore, there's a game to be played in terms of supplying weapons to the Ukrainians to blunt their attack and perhaps even to turn around this aggression.
Yeah. Ukraine has tonight said that the world recognises the country has the right to defend itself by carrying out attacks on Russian military bases and warehouses. But within Russia, is this a dangerous step, do you think, for the Ukrainians to take?
It does represent an escalation. The Ukrainians initially were targeting forces just in Ukraine. But again, as the war moves to a different phase, it makes more sense militarily to attack fuel dumps and ammunition dumps and railheads and other targets inside Russia. And there's also a psychological aspect to this. Actually, Russia has so far done all the fighting in Ukraine. Russia needs to recognize that one of the consequences of its aggression against Ukraine is that this war can come home, as well as the dead Russian troops that Russia has to accept. There's also the prospect of escalation involving attacks in Russia. And the fact that the Ukrainian military are able to do this without being taken down in their attempts of using air power helicopters against fuel dumps and the like, was also a message of just how successful Ukraine has been in rebutting the Russian attack.
Yeah. Let's talk too, though, about Ukraine saying tonight that Russia has really intensified its offensive in the east, with several towns coming under intense attack. Does this indicate to you that Russia has now regrouped itself and enough forces to start this more strategic part of their plan?
Absolutely. What we're seeing is a different phase of the war. The Russians thought they could just drive in and take Kiev, and they didn't need to do that with even the number of forces they had gathered in Belarus. And instead, what they're doing now is reverting to a different type of warfare, long-range artillery, tank formations, and they plan to sweep through the plains of the Donbass region and take more territory, and the annexation of large parts of the country. And they're doing it at a different pace and in a different style, using a war of attrition to do that, rather than just driving down the main road towards Ukraine, which they did in the initial phase of the war. So this will be one that will be probably the biggest tank battle we've seen since the Second World War. It will be a war of attrition. It will be a war that's quite devastating to those areas and to the towns in those areas. And that's partly why the West, the Americans, even the Germans are supplying armored vehicles to the Ukrainians, recognizing that actually to be able to rebut that attack requires a different level of response from Ukraine's armed forces and indeed its allies.
Yeah. UN Chief Antonio Guterres, though, has said that this war will not end until Russia decides to end it. Is that your sense, and what would have to happen for Putin to stop or even retreat?
There's two aspects to that. I mean, this is a war of choice by Vladimir Putin. It is his choice to invade another sovereign country and to impose the barbaric practices that they have done. And it's also the choice of the Ukrainians, in contrast to the Afghans, to actually fight and to make a fight of it. And it may well be the case that at some point Vladimir Putin will say, okay, this war has ended. I have taken back territory. I have destroyed Ukraine, and that's enough for me. But that may not be enough to stop the Ukrainians wanting to gain back the territory they have lost and to avenge the aggression that Putin has put on them. So it takes two to fight, and even if the Russians stop, doesn't necessarily mean the Ukrainians will.
Yeah. David, really great to get your perspective on some of these developments today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.